The word pandemic literally means all people. The clue is there in the name. There's no way to just seal your country off from the world and feel like you're safe. If this virus is spreading anywhere, it's a risk to people everywhere. So after weeks of bad news, of rising COVID cases, new lockdown, and a surge in deaths from the virus, the world got a flood of good news.
A new potential COVID-19 vaccine
is set to transform the battle against coronavirus across the globe.
Throughout this year, rich countries have been involved in what researchers have described as a vaccine buying frenzy.
Canada signed a deal with them in August to secure millions of doses.
If and when this vaccine is approved, we in this country will be ready to start using it.
And as I say, America first.
Within 6 months, many in the UK, the US, and Europe might have received their vaccinations. But for most of the world, total vaccination coverage may still be years away.
Wealthy countries, including the US, have been striking deals with big pharmas, giving rise to fears of vaccine nationalism.
When a country prioritizes its access to a vaccine above everyone else getting it.
Vaccine nationalism only helps the virus.
With something like this, it doesn't make sense to vaccinate one country and leave the virus spreading in another, because at some point that undermines everyone's security. The longer this virus is out in the wild spreading, the more chance there is that it mutates and comes back as something stronger or just something different that isn't covered by the vaccines that would have already been taken by the UK, the US, and other rich countries. We have examples from the recent past of how not to roll out a vaccine. In 2009, the swine flu pandemic was rolling around the world. It was killing hundreds of thousands of people. A vaccine was produced quickly, but unfortunately, poor countries only received their doses months later and in much smaller quantities than was needed. In the case of COVID, if the same thing happens, it could be catastrophic. An American study showed that if you distributed the first round of COVID vaccines equally around the world, you would reduce deaths by more than 60%. If those doses were monopolized by the world's 50 richest countries, deaths would only drop half as much. The pandemic will kill more people and go for years longer than it needs to. One of the major initiatives to get around this so-called vaccine nationalism is something called the COVAX facility.
The World Health Organization creates COVAX, the COVID-19 Vaccines Global Access.
Australia has signed up to a global vaccine agreement.
China has also joined COVAX.
COVAX is basically a giant stockpile of vaccines funded by the private sector and by rich countries, signing its own deals with pharmaceutical companies. COVAX plans to give away vaccines to its 187 members, half of which are poor countries, in an equal share.
The vaccine also must be treated as a global public good, because this pandemic hits everyone.
It's unlikely to be a completely equitable rollout because in the end, countries will do what interests them best. But from what we've seen so far, the COVAX scheme is working. The people pushing COVAX, it's about trying to make it in the interests of poorer countries while also giving something to rich countries to incentivize them to sign up. The only issue is COVAX is competing with countries that have signed their own deals with pharmaceutical companies. Vaccines are considered like any other invention. Whichever company comes up with them gets to own it. They get to decide who makes it, where, what they charge for it. Campaigners are saying, in the case of COVID-19, it doesn't make sense to treat this as business as usual.
Big countries are paying in advance to mop up all the production. What happens to the rest of the world?
We need a new approach. There's momentum building around the world to waive patents and intellectual property rights for vaccines. At this stage, it looks unlikely that a waiver will be secured, but campaigners hope that at least in the negotiations, there will be more carve-outs for poorer countries to access their vaccines more quickly.
No one is safe until everyone is safe.
This won't end until everyone is receiving regular vaccinations. And if we allow that to take years, then it will be years until things return back to normal. There's been a few good signs. The vaccines that are close to approval are much more effective than we hope. In theory, you may need less vaccine in order to reach that herd immunity stage. The world's largest vaccine manufacturer by volume, the Serum Institute of India, said this huge amount of that particular vaccine, which is a cheap one, which is easy to store and transport, will be going to poor countries. It will be distributed equitably. Organizations like Africa's Export-Import Bank are stepping up. and they flagged that they may be able to raise up to $5 billion to buy vaccines for the African continent. The WHO has compared finding a vaccine to reaching the base camp of Mount Everest. It's a good thing, we're there, but there's still a mountain to climb.